He was once considered a national treasure before being exposed as one of the country's most prolific sexual predators. Now, a controversial new Netflix documentary examines how the disgraced paedophile managed to conceal his crimes and fool an entire nation for decades. Cole, you watched this Jimmy Savile documentary last night. What did you think of it?
You know what? I kind of... It's nothing that we didn't already know. To some respect, we know how vile he was, but what I found fascinating about the documentary, especially the first part of it, the first episode of it, was how he got to be so prolific in the respect of he just conned everyone. I mean, you know, the royal family, the Prime Minister. I mean, it was just everyone was on his side, and a whole nation, you know, were fooled by this monster, really, because he was raising millions for charity. But it's you know, it's really weird because I just didn't get the whole Jimmy Savile thing. You know, I was around, you know, at that time we were doing Top of the Pops. Me and my sister, we'd met him a few times, and every time we met him, he used to be like, "Oh, I hope it's not Jimmy Savile this week," because he was always creepy to me. You know,
then.
Yeah,
well, he tried to get you to go back with him.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's difficult for me to talk about that scenario that I had with him because it's nothing compared to what he did.
No, but it would have been, Coleen, had you gone.
Yeah, I mean, I was 14 and my sisters were appearing on Top of the Pops and I was too young at that stage, so they made... Well, he asked, could I stand with him on the podium to introduce them? And then, you know, once they'd done their bit, he said to me, where do you live now? And I said, oh, I still live in Blackpool. And he said, well, I'm there next week and I've got a suite at the hotel. You should come and visit me. And it was like my sisters were like, oh, did he now? You know. So, you know, but nothing happened and I didn't, and I just thought he's a creep. But he was one of them, when we met him, you know, he'd take your hand to kiss your hand, but then he'd lick your hand. Oh, it was horrible.
A lot of people who have seen this sort of popping up on their televisions are sort of saying, look, I don't want to watch this. This should not even have been made. Where do you stand on that, Katie?
No, I think it's really important because if we try and sort of airbrush this from society, like, it really happened. And sometimes when you're silent around these issues, you're complicit in saying it's OK. And the biggest thing about abuse is this shame attached to it. So if you say, well, it can't be on telly, you add that shame and humiliation to the victims. I mean, you've done some really sensitive documentaries, crime documentaries that are centred around the victim, giving them a voice, giving them empowerment. So I think it's the way they're made. And I think it's a good deterrent to future perpetrators to say, you will be found out, you will be reported.
And the victims are finally being heard.
Right. And for the victims they showed last night,
well, I mean,
it must be a relief for them to
There was one, Coleen and I were talking last night, I saw it a few days ago, and there's one particular girl who is in a hospital bed, you can't see her face, and Jimmy Savile holds up a child's drawing with sort of fangs and a devil-like appearance and says, you know, now then, why would you make me look like that? What did I ever do to you? And she just says quietly, everything. And he turns to the camera and says, this is why I love working in hospitals. The man was hiding in plain sight, and it is absolutely appalling that he absolutely revelled in it.
I think what frustrates me as well is these people target vulnerable people, and then we're obsessed with profiling the perfect victim, the perfect perpetrator, and often, like we saw in the Rotherham scandals, these people aren't seen as credible, or they aren't people that you would believe because they've got difficult backgrounds or dependencies or disability. And you're like, well, of course, that's why they're targeted. And then rich celebrities would never be an abuser, and I think we really need to change that mindset.
And of course he was raising, as we know, trillions for these different establishments, one of them being Duncroft, the school. So, of course, there was a blind eye being turned to what these children were saying, because they were children from very bad... You know, they'd had a terrible upbringing and probably wouldn't have believed whatever they'd said. But he was keeping these schools going.
He had the royals.
Oh, in the palm of his hand.
Yeah, but I mean, again, you know, their only experience of him would have been here is this very benevolent man who raises millions for charity.
And Margaret Thatcher, who got him a knighthood.
Yeah, and you know, they wanted to sort of tap into his kind of audience, which was a youth audience, wasn't it, with the television programmes. I mean, he died aged 84 in 2011. They didn't start the investigation until October 2012, but of course, it was actually journalists that started.
Okay.
And I remember, you know, as a young reporter, there was always that sort of, you know, you'd hear people sort of saying, oh, yeah, well, there's something a bit dodgy about him. But without evidence... No. You know, it's very...
I'm devastated he didn't get his proper...
So am I. There was a performance on Have I Got News for You, and the comments he made on that, and Ian Hislop's face, I mean, you could tell what Ian Hislop thought. And the fact that other people within the establishment watched shows like that and heard what he said and still didn't investigate further is absolutely unforgivable.
Well, you know, it's now believed he preyed on about 500 people, with victims as young as 5 years old. And that's why I think documentaries like this are very, very important, because people will see that behaviour and hopefully spot it in the future. So something like that.